In a previous video on virtue ethics, we discussed Aristotelian virtue ethics. That is, the virtue ethics of the Greeks, which rests upon a teleological worldview, because there's one supreme aim, eudaimonia, the flourishing or the fulfilled life. And virtue ethics shares this characteristic with natural law theory, that we create habits of character in order to fulfill our flourishing destiny. And today I want to evaluate virtue ethics with three criticisms. The first is that the virtues are difficult to apply. And you'll find an excellent talk on TED, the website TED by Barry Schwartz, explaining in more detail this point. But virtue ethics is a holistic theory. That means that it includes feelings, motive, and outcome in the actions that we commit to. And the key virtue in virtue ethics for the moral life is phronesis, or practical wisdom. And this could be described in the following way. Practical wisdom is the combination of moral will and moral skill. In other words, it depends upon the will of the individual, the motive, if you like, to try to produce the most beneficial outcome, the outcome that fulfills eudaimonia. And the moral skill is the virtue that we learn by a process of reflection on experience, by good teaching, and by copying our heroes. So moral will and moral skill yields or produces the virtue of phronesis. Now, there's always a problem in ethics when two goods come into conflict. My friend, who I worked with many years ago, was a supporter of Werder Bremen, the football team in Germany, and he would occasionally fly off to Germany to watch his favourite football team, and he'd ask me to cover for him by saying to the head teacher, should the head teacher ask me the question, "Where is Brian?" I was supposed to say, "He is ill, he has flu." Now that is obviously a lie, and truth-telling and honesty is thought of as a virtue. But in this case, the virtue of honesty is in conflict with the virtue of loyalty to my friend. And we need to make a judgment between the two. Now you could argue that only virtue ethics emphasizes that judgment point. And so in that sense, it may actually be superior to the deontological ethics of Kant or the calculating ethics of the utilitarians. Secondly, the virtues and virtue ethics are sometimes criticized as being highly relativistic, in other words, relative to the culture within which they operate. So, for example, the Greeks had a list of virtues, but that list is very different to the list that we produce today. It includes, for example, the virtues of magnificence and the virtue of pride. So what is magnificence? Well, magnificence means buy quality, or always buy the best. Don't drive around in a Deo Matiz, which in my experience was the worst car I've ever driven, if you can afford a BMW. And so the vice of deficiency here is a kind of niggardly attitude or a meanness where you only buy the cheapest when you can afford something better. And the vice of excess here would be a kind of showing off, having a house full of bling with gold furniture, not thinking of any particular US president now, and a very flashy Maserati, which costs you a fortune to run and so on, and you can't take more than two people in. So that would be a vice of excess magnificence. Now, in our age, we've been influenced by Christianity, and Christians have got a particular view of virtues that are very not like the Greeks. For example, we think pride is a sin, and Aristotle thought it was a virtue. And we think, if we're Christians, that obedience is a virtue, whereas for the Greeks, a kind of self-determination would be a virtue. And we think, some Christians would argue, for chastity, where the Greeks never thought of sex in that kind of negative way, that we need to abstain from it completely. So it is true, there is an element by which virtues are made relative to culture, but that doesn't make it relativistic, because I would argue that it is that concept of eudaimonia that shifts its meaning. It's always an attempt to measure ethics by an objective standard. But if you add on the insights of Freud, the psychologist, the sociologist, your friends, Auntie Flo, a politician, whoever you want to put in a group, they will come up with a very different list to the one that Aristotle would have produced. But that doesn't mean to say it's not still based upon some objective grounds. So the virtues may be difficult to apply, they may be relativistic, and finally we could argue that virtue ethics has less emphasis on action than the other two theories. Well, I think this is partially true because it's an agent-centered ethic, and so it won't tend to put laws and rules as of primary importance, as in the deontological ethics of, say, Kant, and nor will they put a kind of utilitarian calculation that adds up specifically the number of people who are happier as a result of our action. The emphasis in virtue ethics is different. It's on building a character that has integrity or consistency. What virtue ethics encouraged us to do is to integrate different aspects of our experience with our personality to produce a person that is whole, that is consistent, that has the overriding virtue of integrity, which we could also think of as a kind of a second nature.